Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share some press plate and die cut cards using the new Say Cheese Classic Pooh collection from Spellbinders and Simple Stories. There are two different press plates. The first one there was Friendly Moment with a couple of beautiful images. And then we have Silly Old Bear Sentiments that has some great, fantastic sentiments for these cards. Then we have the Pooh and Friends silhouette, as well as Tigger and Eeyore, Pooh's Honey Pot, Pooh and Piglet. There's a beautiful alphabet set, as well as a memory frame set. So I'm going to start off by using the press plate sets, and I'm doing them on top of distress watercolor cardstock. I want to create a couple of images, both the images from this set, and I want it to look like old storybooks. So I like the bright white of the distress watercolor cardstock, and I figured it would be a good palette. I'm just using the black ink that comes with the BetterPress system. It's a nice permanent ink. And I'm going to do some watercoloring, so because it's permanent, it's perfect for this. Now, I often do watercoloring with heat embossing so that it creates a ridge around the image. It makes it a little bit easier for doing watercoloring because you don't have to worry about the different areas running into each other. But I didn't want the shine and the raised ridges from that embossing, so that's why I just chose the BetterPress ink. I am going to have to be a little bit careful when I'm doing my watercolors to make sure that I'm not getting anything bleeding into each other, but it's going to create more of the look that I'm going for. So I'm just putting my BetterPress cardstock on the clear plate, taping it in place, putting my plate in the center of my BetterPress base, making sure it's where I want it to be for that particular image, and then inking it with the BetterPress ink, putting the plate on the bottom, putting the clear plate onto the base of the BetterPress, and then running it through my Platinum 6 machine. Now, the ink that comes with the BetterPress is just an archival ink. So anytime I want to clean my plates, I just use archival cleaner, put a little bit on there, and then take my microfiber cloth and wash it off. I typically try to do this anytime I'm using it just to get any excess ink off of it. I don't do really well every single time, but I do definitely try. So I did both of those images on that distress watercolor cardstock, and then I want to do the sentiments on the same cardstock. I want them all to look very similar. Now, I chose the distress watercolor because it's nice and bright white, but if you wanted a little bit more of a classic look, you can easily choose something that's a little bit off-white, and that would be perfect for that. My card bases are a bright white, so sometimes I choose the bright white over an off-white just because of my card bases. So for the sentiments, I use that same black ink, put it on the press plate, put my clear plate to the base, and then ran it through the machine. And I love when they do solid press plates that have multiple sentiments, because you can also cut them all out at the same time and create a bunch of sentiments at once. So very quickly and easily, we end up with 9 different sentiments, which is fantastic. So with that, I have all the sentiments I need for all the cards that I'm creating today, plus a few extras. Now, these are Silly Old Bear sentiments. They are from the Classic Pooh Collection, but there's several of them that aren't necessarily specifically for these images from this collection. The only one that to me is definitely Winnie the Pooh is Silly Old Bear. The other ones say Promise You Won't Forget Me, I'm Never Afraid with You, It's So Much More Friendly with Two, How Do I Love You, I Found Somebody Just Like Me, An Adventure Was Going to Happen, You're a Real Friend, and Time for a Little Something. So you can see how they would work really well with many different cards and many different collections. So for my first cards here, I am going to do the watercoloring with some distress watercolor pencils. These are very quick and easy to do the watercoloring. There's very little mess to them, and they have a little bit more of a chalky classic feel to them, and I figured they were going to go perfect for the look that I was going for. So that first color there that I used for watercoloring Pooh's shirt was Abandoned Coral. I didn't want to do a bright red or anything. I wanted it to be looking a little bit old and a little bit more vintagey, so that's what I chose. And then I chose the Spun Sugar there. That one is for Piglet's face and his arms, anywhere that is exposed. This one here is dried marmalade or marigold. I'm using it for Christopher Robin's legs. I tried to use as few sets as possible, so I'm only using Distress Watercolor Pencil set 6 as well as a couple colors from set 2. So I tried to not take out all 6 of the different sets for this, just to keep the supplies down to a little bit more of a minimum. And it also offered me a little bit more of a challenge when I was creating. So this here, this green is bundled sage. And as I'm doing my watercoloring, I'm trying to get the color in the center of the image and then just fade it out to nothing. I don't want to have the entire thing colored, only because that's the look that I wanted to do this particular day, not because there's anything wrong with coloring the entire image. I just wanted the color to be in the center and then just fade out to nothing. My water brush is a Zig water brush, and it has the water right in the handle, so it makes it nice and easy with very little mess. I don't have to have a jar of water on my desk because I tend to be a klutz and I would likely spill it if I had it there. So having the water right in the handle of the brush works perfect for me. And then I always have a piece of paper towel to my right that I can take any excess color off my brush, or I can squeeze the handle of the brush, flush water through it, and clean my brush for my next color. I've used this same water brush for many years. I want to say 15 to 20 years. It works very, very well, and it's one of my favorite supplies, especially when it comes to watercoloring, because it works so easily and it works for a klutz like me. So once I have as much of that bundled sage there as I want on that first image, I'm going to use the same color for the greenery in the second image. Now I'm watercoloring both images at once simply because I have both of the images done. And by doing them both at once, I can let one dry a tiny little bit before working on the next area, and I can not worry about anything bleeding and blending between the two different areas. I'm not using a ton of water here, so I think even if I just went right from one piece to another, for the most part I wouldn't have a lot of bleeding, because when working with the distressed watercolor pencils, I tend to be a little bit drier when it comes to my watercolor. I tend not to use a ton of water and add a lot of moisture to that paper. I love this bundled sage because it's just a nice light green. There's also forest moss in this same set. I think it's forest moss. So you could do a darker color on some of the areas if you want. Again, I was going for something vintagey, faded, old, so I chose not to add any of the darker color. I chose to stay very muted and very light toned. At this point, I was done with the greens. The top part of that image there, I wasn't too sure what I wanted to do with it, if I wanted to add a different color to it. In the end, I go back with that bundled sage and just do that color. For my water here, I'm just using some Stormy Sky, filling that all in. Now, because there's the little fence there, I'm trying to make sure that I have a reasonable looking gradation between my color. I'm trying not to get too much dark. I'm trying to make it look even, basically. So I'm going up from the bottom to the top, but I am getting more color on my brush as I go because I'm using up all of the color that I have there. But I will go back in and add more color where I think it needs it, to try to make it look like it goes from darker closer to the foreground and then a little bit lighter, a little bit more muted towards the back. Now you can see as I'm doing my watercoloring, I'm constantly moving my brush or moving my piece of cardstock around. I always start where I want my color to be darkest and then fade it out. And it's so much easier to move your piece of paper than it is to turn your hand and have them at a weird angle while you're trying to paint. So once I have the sky done for the first one, I can go in and work on it for the second one. And once again, turning my paper, starting where I want the color to be darkest and then just fading it out till there's no color left. Now, the one thing that I'm trying to do when I'm doing this fading out is I'm trying not to leave edges of water. I don't want to get any watermarks. And if you have puddles of water and large bits of water and it dries unevenly, that's when you tend to get those watermarks. So by starting where I want the color to be darkest and then just fading out and wetting the cardstock when there's not any color on there, I can avoid those ridges. Now these pieces of watercolor cardstock are 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I will be trimming them down for my card. So I don't need to worry about going to the edges anyways. And then by having a larger piece of cardstock and knowing I'm going to trim it down, I can center the pieces a little bit more, because I do know that they're not exactly centered. When I was putting them on the BetterPress, I was trying to center them, but they are a little bit to one side. So by being able to trim them afterwards, I can make sure to center them as I'm doing those trimming. So I grabbed that abandoned coral once again for the shirt and for the shoes on Christopher Robin. And now I'm going in to do the wood from the bridge. Now the first color I grabbed was brushed corduroy, and it ended up being too yellow. It was going to be too close to the color that I was going to use for Winnie the Pooh. So I ended up grabbing vintage photo from set number 2. And that was a much better color to use. I just went right over that brushed corduroy. It blends right in. You see a tiny little bit more of a yellowy tone on that base that I had that brushed corduroy on there. If that is something that really bothers you, you can do the brushed corduroy over the whole fence piece or the whole fence area, and then go back in with that vintage photo. I don't necessarily mind it. And I think it's one of those things that you probably wouldn't really notice too much. So I'm using that vintage photo over that whole fence, trying to make it a little bit darker where the fence posts and the things going horizontal connect, as well as where the fence goes behind Christopher Robin, making sure that there's a tiny little bit of a shadow there. I also take a little bit of color from that brush and kind of streak it just to make it a little bit more like wood, just to give it a little bit more of a natural look that way. And again, because I'm trying to go for light muted tones, I'm not making anything really dark. I'm keeping it very nice and muted. Now I used my BetterPress plates in the BetterPress for this. I think these would look really cool if you did them with the glimmer foil too. I think you could get a really cool look with them as well. I'll have to do that in the future. I don't do that in this video, but it's another option to do them. I think it could create an interesting look with that. So I'm going to continue working with the browns, doing the little trees on the picture on the right, filling those in, and once again making sure or trying to make the color darkest where those at the base of the trees where they go into the ground. Next color we have here is fossilized amber, and I'm using this for Winnie the Pooh. It ends up being a little bit more on the yellow side than I had envisioned in my head. So after doing the fossilized amber, I will go back in with that brushed corduroy, and I will use that to do a little bit of shading around Winnie the Pooh. I do try to make sure to have a little bit of shading on the different areas just to make sure that they're not flat. It makes them look a little bit more interesting if there's shading, or if there's a little bit of areas that have darker and lighter, gives them a little bit more visual dimension. So I go in, my pieces or my areas with that fossilized amber are still wet. So when I go in with that brushed corduroy, it's going to naturally start to blend together. So I'll put in that color, and then I'll take some of the excess off my brush and I'll just blend it in with a clean brush. Then we have some broken china, and I'm just using that for the shirt on Piglet. I'm not sure what color his shirt is supposed to be, so I just went in with a blue. I figured that was going to be a good color to kind of contrast with the pink of his skin. And then I go in with that vintage photo just to add some hair to Christopher Robin, or color the hair from Christopher Robin. It's a little bit more on the ginger side than I would like, but I didn't want to grab another set of watercolor crayons to make it more brown. So I just went with it, made it a tiny little bit lighter, and then I used some blueprint sketch for his shorts. I wanted to make sure that they were a different color blue from the water behind him, so that blueprint sketch worked perfectly for that. And then the scarf on Piglet, I turned that a kind of faded red color, and I used some abandoned coral for that. Now, because I wanted these images to look a little bit muted and a little bit faded, I thought it'd be fun to cut one of them with the decal edge. So I'm using my Tim Holtz decal edge trimmer. I don't use this often, but it's great for when you do want to have a decal edge on something. So my mat here, I cut down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And then my image piece, I'm going to cut this to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. And having those deckled edges on there, it's just a perfect complement to kind of a vintagey looking image. I didn't do it for both of them simply to have something different for each one of them, but it would work easily for each one. I had a different idea for the second one. So once I had that trimmed down, I can glue everything in place. I am gluing everything with my Barely Art glue. I have it in a nice fine bottle here. So this fine bottle, I can use it for smaller die cuts, and I'll be using it later in the video for smaller die cuts, but I can also easily use it for larger pieces here. And the glue starts to grab between the two pieces of cardstock really quite quickly, which I love. I don't have to wait a long time for anything to dry. Then we have one of our sentiments. I already have them ready, obviously, which is so handy. So I can put that in the bottom corner of the card. Now I will often add stickles or glossy accents just to add a little bit of different texture to the cards or the creations that I'm making. I'm not going to do that with these two pieces because I don't want to have that. It's not part of the look that I'm going for. Like I've said a couple times, I'm looking for more of a vintagey muted tone, and I didn't feel that having any stickles or glossy accents on there would fit well with that. I did want to tie in the memory frames though, so I thought for the smaller picture here with Pooh and Piglet, it would work perfect on there. And I have those die cut from Dahlia Cardstock. Works perfectly with that abandoned coral color for his shirt, and then added one of the sentiments to the bottom part of that memory frame there. Now there's also other pieces from that memory frame die set which would work perfectly in that bottom area of their frame. I chose to just add one of the sentiments, keeping it nice and simple. For my next card, I'm using the Pooh and Friends Silhouette die set, and I have that already die cut out of black cardstock. I have all my pieces for my different cards in some medium-sized craft stacks, and I also have the magnetic backgrounds or magnetic panels to go in those craft stacks. And you can see how when I was putting the alphabet dies out or taking the alphabet dies out, I showed you the one on there. The magnetic panel really holds. So if you have dies on there, it's a great way to store your dies while you're using them and not lose them, or even have one of those craft stacks sitting to the side. If you're busy die cutting and you don't want to lose your die cuts in amongst your scraps of cardstock, having one of those craft stacks sitting there to put your dies in, they're a nice secure place to use them. So for the background for this card, I kind of got off on a tangent there. I have some Hammermill cardstock here. It's trimmed down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. The first color ink blended on the bottom is Abandoned Coral, and I went quite a bit higher than I normally would have if I was just using this as a background, but I was keeping in mind my black silhouette piece. That's going to cover most of that, so I'm just going to see a tiny little hint of it above that. I have some Stormy Sky. That's the first blue color that I did with the ink blending, and then some Chip Sapphire. And I'm using some large Spellbinders brushes there. They work perfectly for backgrounds, and they make it really easy to cover a whole background all at once. Then I can use my glue on the background of my die cut. This silhouette is absolutely adorable, and it is a great way to create a super quick and easy card because you really don't need a whole lot. Once I have my silhouette on there, I'm just going to use my Spellbinders shears and just trim off the excess. By cutting that silhouette just a little bit longer, I can make sure that everything is covered once I trim it off, and then trimming it off afterwards. If I were to die cut it ahead of time, there's a chance that I might not have it exactly how I want it to go. So by making it a little bit longer, gluing it to my background, and then trimming it off, I can make sure that it looks exactly how I want it to. Then I put everything onto my card base. I took the Pooh alphabet numbers and more die set and die cut the word friends out of several different colors of cardstock. I was kind of going for the look from the Pooh logo, and it has the different letters in different colors, and it worked perfectly for this. And I chose different colors based on the colors that I was using for the different cards that I was creating today. Now, the one thing to note, my F there that I was showing you, when I die cut it, it die cut backwards. So it's not like that on the front of the package. So I do have a message in to see if that is a error or if that is a design choice, if the package is wrong or if the die is wrong. I'm not going to be able to update that with this video. When I find out the answer, I'll put a note in the my description just in case something needs to be fixed or if there is an error on the front of the package. Nice to know that ahead of time. So just be aware right off the bat that that F it die cuts so it looks like it's backwards. So I glued that on there, and I have my F glued upside down to make it the right way for the look for this particular card. And then I added one of the other sentiments to the bottom right corner. So it looks totally fine on the front of the card. I just want you to be aware that it's going to die cut a little bit differently. For my third card here, I'm using the Tigger and Eeyore die set. I'm not actually using Tigger, I'm just using Eeyore, and I have him die cut out of a bunch of different gray cardstocks. I have some fog, some lunar gray, some graphite, and then the pink sand for the butterfly and the little bow on his tail. For the background of my card, I am doing a little bit of ink blending with some bundled sage, stormy sky, and chipped sapphire. So the stormy sky and chipped sapphire are the same two colors or same two blues that I used on the last card, but I didn't want that coral color on the bottom, so I added in that bundled sage. And I'm trying to make my ink blending here fairly light and muted to kind of coordinate with those watercolor pieces that I was creating. I want all my cards to coordinate and look nice together, so I'm kind of going for the same look with all of them in color tone ways. So once I have that ink blended, I can take that off of my sticky mat, and then I'm going to do a little bit of ink blending on my die cut pieces before I start to assemble them. So I'm just putting those on my sticky mat, and I did make sure to clean off my mat in between. I don't want to accidentally get any of those blues or greens ink blended on there. So I do try to make sure to clean it off in between to make sure I don't have any ink contamination. Now, my sticky mat really needs to be washed. So you'll see sometimes when I'm doing my ink blending that it moves on me. And that's mainly because I've used it a whole lot since the last time I washed it. If that happens to you and if that's bothering you, you just have to wash it under some warm water with some soap and it comes out like new. Now, when I say it comes out like new, those ink stains are going to stay there. It's dye ink that I use most of the time, and dye ink dyes things. So I don't necessarily worry about how my sticky mat is looking. I'm more worried about how it's functioning, or concerned with how it's functioning. So once I have it cleaned off, it will stick to my surface and it won't move around while I'm doing my ink blending. With all the ink blending around my Eeyore completely done, I'm ready to assemble him. And I'm not sure if I said it, but I used hickory smoke for that, as well as to do a little bit of ink blending for the bottoms of the clouds. Now, these die sets are really easy to put together. When you have little pieces on them, there's often little indent marks that get put right into the die cut. So it shows you exactly where things are supposed to go and what is supposed to line up with where. So putting them together goes really quickly and easily. The hardest part really is die cutting a bunch of different pieces. That's the part that takes the longest. And by having glue in a fine line bottle, when I go to glue all these tiny little pieces together, it also comes together really quickly because I can just put little dots of glue if I want. For behind Eeyore's eye, I just have a scrap of black cardstock there. I'm just going to put a circle of glue around his eye and just put it onto that scrap of cardstock. And you'll see that I have an acrylic block there. I use my acrylic block often when I'm assembling die cuts. Put that on top of whatever is drying just to hold everything nice and flat. That way my hands are free to work with other things. I don't need to hold things down and make sure that everything is gluing how I want. The acrylic block is going to do that for me. And it's a tool that I only use for this pretty much now. Used to use it obviously for stamping, but really use the MISTI a lot more now. So I don't really use my acrylic blocks for anything other than things like this. So I have a black mat that I put on behind my ink blended background for this card, and then I put my ink blended background down. The other bonus by using this acrylic block is I can arrange, or I can place my die cuts on there how I would like to arrange them on my card, and then I can just set that to the side and I know exactly where I want everything to go. I don't have to remember anything, and then I can just transfer that to the front of my card. So it comes in really handy because I can see exactly how those die cuts are going to look right on my background. I don't have to imagine how it's going to look, and I also don't have to worry about remembering what I was going to put where. So as I'm gluing the clouds to the background of my card here, I am letting them go a little bit beyond my ink blended background. I'm not going all the way to the card edge, but a little bit into the black mat. I sometimes like the way it looks when my die cuts go a little bit beyond my piece or my focal piece. I think it just gives it a little bit more of an interesting look. Last step is to add that little butterfly, and I am going to add a little bit of glossy accents to this particular card, just a tiny little bit of stickles around the edges of the butterfly wings for a little bit of sparkle, and then some glossy accents for Eeyore's eye as well as the body part of the butterfly. It's just going to add a little bit of shine and a tiny little bit of dimension. I'm not adding a lot, just for a little bit of different texture on the card, just to give it something that catches the light and catches your eye. So this card is totally done. I'm going to set that aside for that glossy accents to dry. And for my next card, I'm using the Pooh and Piglet die set. I have the balloon die cut out of Dahlia Cardstock, and then the pieces for Winnie the Pooh die cut out of beeswax cardstock, and then the black parts are some Onyx cardstock. Now I'm going to do a little bit of ink blending around these die cuts as well. It just gives them a little bit of visual dimension. So I'm using some abandoned coral around the balloon, and then I'm using some fossilized amber around the pieces for Winnie the Pooh. When I do this ink blending, it's very light. It's just a little bit of color around the outside edges, but I think it really adds to the look of it. It's not a step that you necessarily need to do. You can just glue them flat, but I really love the look that it gives and the added dimension or the visual dimension that it gives. So I'm doing this around all the edges of the different die cuts. There's not a ton of the different die cuts for Winnie the Pooh. There's these 5 pieces here, and then a few pieces to go underneath his ear, underneath his eye to give him a black eye or a black pupil, and then for the tip of his nose. So once that is done, I can start assembling my different die cuts here. The little string has a round piece at the very end of it that you can put glue on for adding the balloon to it. And I'm going to add some glue to the back parts of his earpiece as well as his eyepiece to attach those little black pieces behind there and add those details. You can see how quick and easy having glue in a really fine tip makes it. You only need to use a dot of glue for these pieces, and they come together really quite easily. Now my cards that I'm creating today are 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. This particular die set, if you wanted to create a slimline card, you could have Pooh standing walking, and the string to the balloon is really, really long. So this would be a perfect one to do as a slimline card. I'm choosing to have him sitting down in the corner of the card, and I'll have the balloon going at a little bit of an angle so that it fills up the rest of the card. I didn't want to change the sizing of the card just for this particular one, but I just wanted to mention that that is also an option. For my mat for this, I'm just using some Onyx cardstock again, and I have that trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4. My image piece is going to be trimmed down to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. I'm going to use the same distress colors as the last card for doing my ink blending for my background. However, for this one, I'm going to concentrate the color on the center, make it look a little bit more like the 2 images that I watercolored at the beginning, having the color in the center and then kind of fading out to nothing. I'm going to start with that bundled sage, and this is where that large Spellbinders ink blending brush really comes in handy because it's really easy to get a really light coat of color and then blend it out to nothing. These brushes are super, super soft, so you can get a really light coat of the color if you want. Obviously, because my brush keeps going in the center of the cardstock, that is going to naturally be heavier because of the way that I'm ink blending it for this. For my darkest color, the Chip Sapphire, I'm going to kind of concentrate that a little bit more in the top right corner because that's where I want the balloon to go, and I want that color to be right behind the balloon there. With that ink blending done, I'm ready to add those pieces to my card base. So I can glue all of those down. I'm just choosing a black mat around this because it goes with some of the different accent pieces, the balloon string, as well as the eyes, ears, and nose of Winnie the Pooh. If you wanted it to be a different color other than black, you could use the beeswax cardstock or the Dahlia cardstock. Either one of those would work as well, but I really love just the classic look of the black cardstock around it. It also ties in really nicely with the sentiment piece as well. So once those pieces are down, you can see how I just used the acrylic block just to check and make sure that the layout that I was planning was going to work for the front of this card. And it's nice to be able to have that see-through block on there to be able to easily check that. Then I can glue down the Winnie the Pooh and then the balloon as well as the string and then my sentiment. And I had one sentiment picked out here, and then at last second I decided to swap it out for one of the other sentiments that I had ready. So it's always nice to have a bunch of sentiments there if you make a last minute change or just have a lot of choice between the different sentiments that you have available. So this card here is done and ready to go, but I did want to add some glossy accents to the balloon. It's going to look really nice to have a little bit of glossy shine as well as that rounded dimension of the glossy accents on the balloon. I do my glossy accents kind of like icing a cookie. So I'll do a line around the outside edges and then do a flood coat inside it. That way I can concentrate and make sure the lines around the outside edges are nice and smooth. And then as I'm flooding the inside, that glossy accents will naturally go and level out, and it will make a nice smooth surface for it. You do have to wait a while for it to dry depending on how large of an area. And this one, because it's a larger area, it is going to take probably over an hour for that to completely dry. When you first put it down, it's kind of got a milky look to it. And then when it's dry, it's going to be completely clear. So I tuck that aside to dry while I'm working on my next card. And for the next one, I'm using Pooh again, but I'm also bringing in Pooh's Honey Pot. Right on the die set for Pooh's Honey Pot, there is a suggestion that you can use them together and you can have Pooh sitting in the large honey pot. And I thought that was absolutely adorable. So I'm going to do that, but I'm also bringing in some of the little honey pots from the Pooh and Piglet die set so that there's several different pots of honey there for him to snack out of. So I'm going to do a little bit of ink blending for my pieces before starting to assemble them. So once again, I'm bringing in that fossilized amber to go around my pieces for Winnie the Pooh. I have Winnie the Pooh die cut out of that beeswax cardstock, and then the honey pieces are die cut out of Tuscan cardstock. My honey pots as well as the labels are die cut out of latte cardstock, portobello, and then alabaster. So the alabaster cardstock is that cream cardstock that I'm using for the labels as well as the little fabric cover. I'm ink blending all of them with some Gathered Twigs Distress ink, but I'm making sure to do the darker colored cardstocks while I have fresh ink on my brush, and the lighter colored pieces for the label done with the alabaster when my brush is fairly dry. So I'm not getting a lot of dark brown on there. I am just getting a little bit of a kind of a vintagey outline to them. Once I have all of that ink blending done, I can start assembling my pieces. So I'm going to put Pooh right in that big honey pot there, glue him right down there, and then glue the honey right on the edge of it, placing his arms how I want them to go. I do need to make sure that I have that one arm there so that the arm's coming from his shoulder instead of from his waist like I had originally put that there. Then there's a piece of honey that can go right on, or a die cut for honey that can go right on his hand, looking like he's got it dripping right off of his hand. And then I can add the black pieces for behind his eyes and ears and the one for his little nose piece. Now there's a ton of different die cuts here. This is where having those craft stacks really come in handy, because for all of the cards that I created, I had a different craft stacks for each one of them with the different die cuts in there. So it kept it nice and even, or nice and organized. And I knew exactly where everything was and what pieces went with what card. So they come in very handy so that you don't have to worry about losing any die cuts because they're all enclosed. And then anytime that I have a project where I also want to die cut something while I'm working with it, I'll just put that die right in there. And with those little magnetic panels in there, it's going to hold that nice and securely. So I don't have to worry about losing a die in amongst all of that either. Having the fine tip on this glue bottle makes it really handy for the small die cuts as well as the large one. They come together really, really quickly and easily. And it's really easy to know exactly what piece goes for which one because of those little indentations that I was talking about earlier that happen when you die cut them. Any area that has a piece that goes over on top, there's a little outline there. So it shows you exactly where everything goes. I die cut for the pieces for the little bees a couple times. I wanted to have a few bees on my card. So I did the base of the body with the Onyx cardstock. I did the yellow parts with that beeswax cardstock. And then I wanted the wings to look a little bit transparent, so I die cut them out of a scrap of vellum. And so you can see the yellow and the black underneath them. And I think it looks really cute having the wings out of that vellum. It works perfect. I am just going to use dots of that liquid glue to glue that together, put that underneath my acrylic block to hold it while it's drying. And here is that finished card before we start assembling. Now, before we start assembling, I thought this Because 3D embossing folder would be the perfect background. It has some little honeycomb on there as well as some bees. Works perfectly with these die cuts. So I have a piece of hammermill cardstock here that I have trimmed down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches, and I just put that where I wanted it to go in my 3D embossing folder, and then put that through my die cutting machine for the 3D embossing stacking. Now, you could leave it as is with just that white cardstock, but I thought some yellow ink on there would be really nice. So I'm taking that fossilized amber again, just doing a touch of that yellow ink right around the edges. And then when I have my brush a little bit dry, I'm just blending it in just slightly over that honeycomb. I don't want a fully yellow background here because I want Pooh to stand out. So by adding that around the edges, it's going to tie those die cuts in, and it's going to add a little bit of that yellow color on that honeycomb, but really, really faintly and not over the entire piece. So I'm still going to be able to really see my die cuts as a focal point on the center part of my card. My mat here, I die cut, or I trimmed down once again out of black cardstock. So it is trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. Then I can glue down that embossed piece there. And whenever I glue down an embossed piece, I make sure that there's a good amount of glue on the recessed pieces that are going to have contact with my card base. I want to make sure that it's glued down securely. And I'm going to do the same thing for any of the pieces that get glued down on the front. I want to make sure, because I have that texture from that embossing, that it's got good contact with my card and that it's going to glue down properly. So I'm going to glue down all of my pieces here, and then I'm just going to put my acrylic block on there and let that sit for a few minutes to make sure that that pushes those die cuts down and make sure that that does have some good contact. And while I'm doing that, I can put my little extra smaller honey pots as well as the bees around and make sure that I have a layout that I like before I start gluing anything onto my card backgrounds. So once I have a layout that I like, I can glue those pieces down there. And once again, making sure to add a ton of glue so that I have some good contact with that textured embossed surface. So I'm adding all these extra honey pots here. You could even leave these out if you wanted. I thought they looked great all together, but if you wanted a background that looked a little bit, or that had a little bit less on there, you could easily leave that off there. The bees, though, I think are perfect to go around the honey pot with Pooh in it while he is eating the honey. I think that's perfect having those bees around there. And I love that 3D embossing folder in the background. It ties it in beautifully. The last step here is I'm going to be using a bunch of glossy accents. I just put it on the end of the antenna for the bees inside Pooh's eye so that it has some gloss to it as well as his nose. And then I thought it would be great if all of the honey drips and blobs had glossy accents on there. So I am putting it all on there at once. Now, another option here would be to leave those bees off for now, or at least that bee that I put on the honey. Put the glossy accents on there, let it completely dry, and then add the bee to it. I opted to do it all at once. I was running short on time and I wanted to make sure to get the card done. So I'm just putting my glossy accents around the outside areas of the bee. So it's not completely covering anything underneath there, but really it's one of those details that you don't really even notice unless it was pointed out. Now, I absolutely love the way this card turned out. That Because 3D embossing folder, it looks perfect behind Winnie the Pooh in that honey pot, and the glossy accents on that honey are the perfect finish. Here is the little Winnie the Pooh with the balloon and the glossy accents on there. Once again, as well, is the perfect finish. It just adds that little bit of extra texture. Then we have Eeyore with the butterfly and the gloomy clouds in the sky. And you know, I used these dies today and the press plates today to create many different cards, but I think these would absolutely be adorable inside frames on, like in a child's nursery. I think they would be perfect for that as well. So there's a lot of different things you could use with them. They would also be great for doing scrapbook layouts. I love the way that Pooh and Friends silhouette card turned out. Such a simple card, but absolutely adorable. And then finally, our watercolored press plate images. They look like they were taken right out of an old vintage storybook, and I love the way they turned out as well. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.